what's white fragility? That's the title of your book, is White Fragility. And the subtitle is why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. Why white fragility, and how do we recognize it?
You know, the fragility part is meant to capture how little it takes to set white people off, to set us off into defensiveness. So for many white people, the mere suggestion that white has meaning will cause us to erupt in defensiveness. For many of your listeners, the fact that I'm generalizing right now about white people will set off the defensiveness. Individualism is a really precious ideology for white people, and we do not like to be generalized about.
You speak very frankly in the book about how you've stepped in it yourself, if I can use that phrase. Can you give an example of where you experienced your own white fragility?
So I'm in a room with 3 black women, 2 of which I'm very close to, and 1 I don't know at all. And she gives us a survey to fill out, and it's tedious to me. It seems kind of template. It doesn't capture the nuance of what we do. So I push it aside and I say, let me explain. We go out into these different offices and we do these anti-racism trainings. In fact, Deborah here was asked not to come back when she went to such and such office. I guess her hair scared the white people. She has long locked braids. So I want you to notice what I'm doing. Not only am I making a joke about a black woman's hair, which is a sensitive issue, and I do know better, but I'm positioning myself as the cool white person, and they're all the clueless white people.
All right. I'm Ben Burgis. This gives them an argument. I am joined once again by returning guest Norm Finkelstein, author of I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, where he has a chapter where he talks about the woman who was just on screen, Robin DiAngelo. And, you know, I thought it might be interesting to get him on for his thoughts because, you know, it looks like yet another one of these people has fallen. You know, DiAngelo has been facing accusations of plagiarism. It's been in the news the last week. So how are you doing today, Norm?
I'm doing fine. I have to confess that the Robin DiAngelo chapter is my favorite in the book. It's, yes. It's totally unscholarly. Well, you cannot actually have a scholarly discussion about Robin DiAngelo. That's like having a scholarly discussion on Knucklehead Smith. It just doesn't fly. But it is a subject of ample. It's a rich load of mockery for something that's just totally preposterous, I have to say. This whole notion that she's fighting racism, or as she calls it, interrupting racism. I'm not quite sure what that means.
Well, it's interesting because it's like almost the terminology of like tech entrepreneurs who talk about like disrupted industries.
I'm not familiar with that terminology, but I was taken aback when I saw this expression, which is apparently a commonplace in that particular milieu of white lunatics about interrupting racism. It's, you know, in a moment's reflection, this stuff is just so utterly vacuous, as is Robin DiAngelo, the person, that you have to ask what's the obvious question, namely, what accounts for its traction? It was striking to me that, as you know, Ibram X. Kendi had his travails about a half year to a year ago when questions were raised about his financial stewardship of his anti-racist center at Boston University. And it was striking then, and it's again striking with Robin DiAngelo, how quickly the New York Times, woke central, rose to both of their defenses. So about, I would say, maybe 3 months ago, the New York Times ran this interminable article in the magazine section on Ibram X. Kendi. And at that point, Kendi was, he was in the doggy house. Mm-hmm. And Times was obviously committed to resurrecting his reputation. What was most striking about the Times article on Kendi was when you talk about a person who is reputed to be a scholar, the very first thing anybody does in the academic world is you solicit the opinions of other scholars.
Right.
How do you rate his scholarship? What contributions has he made? What are your criticisms? Well, the Times runs this utterly interminable article. I confess to not having gotten through more than half. And they ask one obscure sociologist who they just describe as an academic or as a sociologist, I forgot which, her opinion of his scholarship. Otherwise, we read about his handkerchiefs, we learn about his smiles, we learn about how engaging or non-engaging he is, but there's no discussion whatsoever of his scholarship. The woman who wrote the article, I gathered, had her MA in art history from Harvard. Why do you ask an MA in art history? The answer is perfectly obvious. They're not interested in this scholarship. This is all a shtick. And it's the same thing with Robin DiAngelo when the plagiarism charges came out. Frankly, I think the whole field is so completely bankrupt that I don't much care who she plagiarized because they're all completely vacuous. But the Times immediately rose to her defense again. If you look at the Times article on DiAngelo's plagiarism, oh, it's not so significant. Oh, really? It's not so significant. Now here is a very obvious comparison. So the New York Times, as you know, is woke central. It's been transformed into a kind of tabloid newspaper, and its mascot is wokeism. So we had the case of Claudine Gay at Harvard. Okay? So she was charged with plagiarism. Now, it was a very interesting moment. The attacks that occurred in that period was the most spectacular assault on academic freedom in American history. There's never been anything like it. Now, I will grant there was the McCarthy period, but the McCarthy period was an assault on academic freedom by the state. It was a politically organized, orchestrated campaign. This is something altogether different. These were private entities, people like Bill Ackman, who decided that because they're billionaires, it's their right to decide who will be president of Harvard, who will be president of University of Pennsylvania, who will be president of Columbia University. And by the end, the final reckoning, I'm leaving aside those presidents who weren't unseated, people like the Brown University president who came under assault by Sternlicht. But by the end, not one, not two, but three Ivy League presidents had been deposed.
Yeah, and there was an element of the state. I mean, there were congressional hearings, but you're right. It was driven by the billionaires.
Yes, totally agree with what you just said. But here's the thing: the Times didn't protest that. They didn't protest that Claudine Gay was obviously being deposed because she was insufficiently repressive of the anti-genocide movement on the college campus. They didn't protest that. They didn't say these charges of plagiarism are completely so trivial. I mean, in the case of Claudine Gay, at least she plagiarized serious scholarly work. No, really, that's to her credit. If you remember, later, Bill Ackman's wife
Hmm.
uh, came under attack for her plagiarism, and she got her degree from MIT, and she plagiarized Wikipedia.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. If you're going to plagiarize, you should,
really,
at least plagiarize something real. Yeah. I mean, I do think that at the time, I did see some people trying to argue that the Claudine Gay plagiarism didn't really matter because it was relatively trivial, or because the sort of field that she was in, that writing doesn't matter that much, or etc. And I was never very convinced by all of that. I thought, it's like, no, clearly she did something that if like a student of mine did that, they would fail the class, right? I mean, like, they should. And but at the same time, I mean, I think you can cope, I think you can have room for both of these, right? Like, it was pretty clear that the motivation for going after Claudine Gay was not really a sudden upsurge of passion about academic standards. It was that, as you say, she didn't repress, student protesters, with like enough ferocity or quickly enough to satisfy to satisfy these people. So I mean, the agenda was to go after free speech on campuses. It just happened that she had that, like, her history gave the material to work with.
yes, I totally agree with that. I'm simply making the point that this wokeism is very selective. They defended Robin DiAngelo. They defended Ibram X. Kendi. But when it clashed with a ruling elite
Right.
interest, in this case Israel, they threw them all to the wolves. I mean, if you remember during that period, this is the era of wokeness, liberal wokeness, okay? So women of color have a special immunity because they suffer from what's called intersectional oppression. That didn't help Claudine Gay. That didn't help President Shafiq at Columbia University. And McGill was a woman at U of P. It didn't help her. When the ruling elite decides that one of their interests is at stake, they throw these intersectionally oppressed women to the wolves, to the dogs. But Robin DiAngelo, who's a certifiable airhead, Ibram X. Kendi, who is a certifiable airhead, but they're useful. They're useful. They're useful for uh, uh, burnishing the woke bona fides of places like the Times, because they're totally harmless. They're totally innocuous. They don't threaten any institutions of power. So you promote them and let those people be the spokespersons, uh, the spokespersons for anti-racism and the spokespersons for wokeness in general. They,
Well,
they, they pose no threat whatsoever.
well, I want to get into that harmlessness, because one of the first things you point out in your chapter about Robin DiAngelo, and I'll burn that bridge when I get to it, is that her, in her book, White Fragility, she why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism, that she defines racism initially in structural terms, and even makes a couple of comments about it having something to do with economics. But then her actual solution to it seems to be, I think the phrase you use is, it fits very comfortably within the genre of self-help.
Yeah. Um, Let me just backtrack
Uh,
a bit. In my era, when we were growing up, even the era of Martin Luther King and others, fighting racism was something very concrete. It was about desegregation. it was about removing legal obstacles and hurdles to full equality in the United States. In the case of Jews, it meant things like access to Ivy League universities, which discriminated against Jews. It meant access to housing, which was obviously an overlap with African American people. It meant access to elite law firms, which were they were called the white shoe law firms, which were all a WASP. So you can easily gauge, you can easily measure whether or not you are achieving any concrete results. And the rest was, speaking honestly, the rest was pretty much beside the point. Jews never cared about whether they were loved.
Right.
They never much cared if you carried stereotypes about them, because everybody recognizes that the mind is so complex that to try to rid it or extirpate stereotypes is maybe a Sisyphean labor, or it's one that will take ages to overcome. That wasn't on the agenda. I remember one of the lines I always liked by Martin Luther King. He was at one point, maybe it was at the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, but it was probably a little later. I can't remember the exact juncture. But he was told, well, with all of this nonviolence and all of this disruption, they said to him, that you're alienating white people. And this is not the way to get white people to love you. Like, carried on in this fashion. And King's retort was, for now, my concern is that white people don't lynch us.
Right.
I'll worry about the love thing later. And that was a perfectly rational order of priorities. First of all, the first goal ought to be equality of opportunity, obviously, because that's the main concern. And the second goal is just very elusive. W.E.B. Du Bois, who I spent some time reading to juxtapose against the Gook of Ibram X. Kendi, when he started out in the late 19th century, he thought that racism was mostly due to ignorance. So he felt if you enlighten people about the facts, that would eliminate racism. Well, that obviously wasn't the case. And then he took a trip to Africa, and he said that he suddenly realized for the first time the extent to which the fantastic wealth of Europe was dependent on racism. So now he began to look at the material component of racism. And then when he began to examine the relationship of blacks to whites in the South, and he saw that black people preferred to have a lower standard of living than they would have had if they united with black people. They preferred a lower standard of living so long as they were, quote unquote, superior to black people.
Yeah, this is the psychological wages of whiteness argument.
Exactly. So if you watch Du Bois's evolution, you could see that his notion of the roots of racism become more and more complex. And then it seems he came under the influence of Freud, and he started to talk about the irrational aspects of racism, what he called, for example, I'm using his expression, the sex jealousy of white folks, and obviously it took the very ugly form of the lynchings on the pretext of there were rapes and so on and so forth. And so when he had to deal with that last component of racism, Du Bois said, that's a very tough struggle. And he really had no answers for it, because it has to do with, the irrational aspects of the mind and how you control, how you master them. And everybody knows from his or her own personal life how complicated that is, to the point I think it's impossible.
Well, I mean, one thing that really strikes me about that is, that, well, two things, I guess. One is that I mean, even if you think about Du Bois, right, he ends his life as a convinced communist, and presumably, at least by then, he thinks that that fighting for a better society would also be in the interests of those, white workers, that they'd been, maybe sold a bill of goods, that the psychological wages, as Nuri says in the chat, doesn't pay the mortgage. But also that, and presumably on that view, right, one of the reasons for widespread prejudice, and it's obviously not the only one, because there are, all kinds of prejudices that survive historically for all sorts of strange reasons after you would expect them to. But a lot of it has to do with material disparities, that in every society where there's an underclass that is, doing much worse than the majority group, people convince themselves that it's because they're, genetically lazy or, whatever, right? They tell some kind of story about how to, about why it's actually okay that these people are in a materially worse position, which suggests that creating a, more materially equal society might help with that. But then the other thing is, that really hit me again, rereading your chapter about DiAngelo, is that if you wanted people to, to get over racial prejudices and to relate to people of all races, like they do to everybody else, it seems to me that the worst thing you could do is sort of put yourself under the tutelage of this Robin DiAngelo stuff that makes it more or less impossible to have a normal friendship or relationship, with anybody of another race, because it trains you to constantly interrogate every microscopic detail of every interaction for traces of prejudice. That, that if you, even like, you quote things where even not saying racist things, she thinks is actually evidence in a strange way of racism. That, that it's if you've been trained not to say racist things, you've been trained to self-censor. If you don't cry when you hear about the death of a black person, that's evidence of racism. If you do cry, then you're reinscribing racism, whatever that might mean. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I guess what she has to say is just so crazy. Everything is, there was a song in my era, sugar in the morning, sugar in the evening, sugar in the summertime. And she's racism in the morning, racism in the evening. There's nothing else. There's not much. I don't blame her. It's a good check at the end of the day, a hefty sum to deposit in the bank. But I'll tell you, maybe this sounds a little bit callous on my part.
Yeah.
I don't really care about eliminating. I don't want to get technical.
Sure.
But there's a difference between prejudice and racism. Everybody carries prejudices, and it's possible, in my opinion, to fight them. The only way, my own view, the only way you can defeat these kinds of prejudices is by concrete experience and concrete example. I'll give you an example. So when I'm growing up, I had these two friends, Peter Adisman and Stephen Schlossberg, and they were aspiring Ivy League types. So in my era, if you wanted to be Ivy League, you're supposed to play tennis and golf. Okay. So they start playing tennis and golf. And at one point, we have a conversation, and they say, you know why there are no black people in tennis or golf? Because I'm talking about the 1970s now.
Mm-hmm.
Why there are no black people? They said, because tennis and golf require intelligence. That's what they said.
Mm-hmm.
Tennis and golf. Now, nobody would say that anymore because we've had our Arthur Ashes and we've had the sisters, Selena, what's her sister's name?
Oh, yeah. Serena and Williams?
Venus, yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Venus and Serena, yeah.
So,
and we've had Tiger Woods and, so on, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So you defeat that stereotype, not in theory, not by meeting in a group chaired by Robin DiAngelo. It can only be overcome in practice and in real life experience that concretely and indisputably, and that's important, concretely and indisputably refutes the prejudice that people carry. So, short of that, I don't believe that you can defeat these prejudices. We take the obvious one of intelligence and inherent racial differences in intelligence. Some people think everybody should read Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Men.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I don't think that gets you anywhere. First of all, there are always counter arguments. Secondly, there are about 6 people in the world who understand that level of knowledge of genetics. He has a chapter in The Mismeasure of Man on factorial analysis. I can't understand that. The point being, if you believe it, it's not because you've been convinced. It's because you walk into the book believing it. The only way you actually refute irrefutably,
Mm-hmm.
the only way you refute irrefutably those sorts of prejudices is when there are more African Americans in the highest levels of science, in physics, in abstract mathematics, and when they're competitive, when they start racking in the Nobel Prizes and the field medals in math, at that point, it becomes, you reach that critical mass where they're winning so many awards that it's no longer tenable to claim they are inferior. I will give you one other example, which is very vivid from my own life. Growing up, Jews, I don't know if you're Jewish or not, but Jews could excel in the sciences and in math and also in cultural endeavors, but Jews were never seen as martial or physical. Now, what shattered that stereotype? It's very simple. The answer is the Israeli army. The moment Jews, I'm not saying this is a positive thing, I'm talking about as a factual thing. The moment Jews became fighters, the notion that every Jew is like Woody Allen was shattered. You can't prove that Jews aren't physically feeble. You can't use genetic evidence because the only thing that can persuade is a real life example. And incidentally, people like Frederick Douglass
Mm-hmm.
and Du Bois uh, both homed in on the fact that there was one very common stereotype about black men, that they were cowards.
Mm-hmm.
And what overturned that stereotype? What overturned it was the organization of two black regiments in the Civil War, and the fact that they were courageous beyond average
Mm-hmm.
and suffered many losses. Even Douglas's son, Frederick Douglass, had one of his sons. It may have been even two. My memory is one, but it could have been two. He wanted them to fight. Now, really, they could have died. The Civil War was a very bloody affair. 700,000 people were killed. That was no small potatoes. But there was a recognition that the only way you can overturn a prejudice or a stereotype was by real life achievement. So I have many African American students,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't struggle a la Robin DiAngelo with my racist demons. No, what I do is, guess what? I help them. I help them achieve. If they have ability in math and science, I always say you should go into the sciences not just for you, but to shatter the stereotype. If you have the capacity in math or you have the capacity in physics, you should go into it not because it's necessarily better than another profession, but because it serves a very positive social good, not least for young black people, young black students, because black people, for whatever reason, they carry a real phobia about math and science. If you ask any young black person, 9 out of 10, I'm not good at it. I said, what do you mean you're not good at it?
I mean, to be fair, in my experience, the vast majority of young white people say they're not good at it too, right? Like,
look, that's a fair comment, but there is a tier who think they are good at it. TIER. There is a tier. There isn't in the African American community. But my point is, if you're serious about trying to fight racism, then you're trying to create and preserve and create opportunities. Now, there is a fact which I consider indisputable.
uh,
A lot of white people carry all of these prejudices, which come out in tiny ways, mostly in terms of expectations of non-whites. And it requires a determined effort to fight that. But I believe you fight it by doing your best to make sure that your student who's non-white gets his or her fair chance. And that was always what the struggle against racism was about. It was about equalizing opportunity. It wasn't about interrupting the demons in your mind, which you can't do in the first place.
Well, so when you talk about equalizing opportunity, it seems to me that there are a couple of different, substantively different things that people could mean and often do mean, right? So, the first is just, and the most obvious, as you say, right, in the era of the original civil rights movement, is removing legal barriers, right? Having equal opportunity in that sense. But then once that has been accomplished, there's maybe a more interesting debate about, what's left to be done. So once you've eliminated legal discrimination, there's a very, effectively very popular answer to what's left to be done that, says, okay, the essential problem here is that once you eliminate discrimination, this still leaves these massive disparities that, you have you have a higher percentage of the black population than the white population, living in poverty, going, live, in substandard housing, going to worse schools, being fed into the criminal justice system, et cetera, and a lower, proportionally lower number of black people than white people who are, rising up within the sort of social and economic hierarchies that exist in our society. And, a lot of what you're saying is kind of an academic version of that, that's like, okay, well, the remaining problem is that you have, fewer black, mathematicians and physicists. And I certainly wouldn't want to denigrate the idea that there's positive value in people having role models, seeing that this is something they can do. But, and I think in a way this does get us back to DiAngelo, because there is, I think, then a really interesting division about, okay, well, hold on though. When we look at the kind of society that we live in right now, is the problem that you have the wrong proportions of members of each group at different levels of that society, or is there a more basic problem with the way that the society is organized, right? I mean, this is the kind of point that somebody like Adolf Reed would always make, that it doesn't really seem like, justice would necessarily mean that you have the demographically correct proportions of people living in poverty and the demographically correct proportions of people on, executive, on, I don't know, the boards of directors of, major corporations, because really the problem is that nobody should be living in poverty, and, we should be having, a more equal society. And I think that thinking about that divide does maybe get us to the question that you raised earlier, but, didn't really answer, which, I mean, is not a criticism. I mean, you certainly do in the book, but, I wanted to foreground it here, which is, look, given how vapid and ridiculous the DiAngelo thoughts about racism are, what accounts for why this is such a phenomenon? I mean, this is, white fragility, whatever else changed or didn't change after George Floyd summer in 2020, the sales of white fragility certainly went through the roof, right? So, what is it about what she was selling that at least sort of met the appetites of our society at that moment?
Well, because you get to pretend you're doing something about racism. You get to pretend that you're cutting edge. You get to pretend that you're radical chic, when in fact you're doing nothing at all. Because, well, who even needs Robin DiAngelo? What, black people can't speak for themselves? If you have a problem in an office, okay, sit down and you talk about it. And you say, we have a problem here. I'm going to sit down and talk about it. Who needs her as an interlocutor? This complete airhead who thinks she has a special pipeline to the hood. Black people be trusting me. Just ridiculous. This cool white chick, like the old Black Panther groupies, the Black Panther white groupies. Just, who needs her? I'm sure everybody's mumbling under their breath at the end of each of her sessions.
Which is the other thing, by the way, talk about the sessions that always got to me about this stuff, which is that if somebody wants to have a struggle session to think about their internalized racism on their own time, then, fair enough, I suppose, not really of interest to me, but it actually always seemed like a problem to me on a workers' rights level that people could be forced to do this in the workplace by their boss, that they bring in this person to scold them about their internalized racism, while they're at work.
The boss and everybody else, because they subscribe to this nonsense, it puts them on a pedestal, like they're above the racism of these backward white workers. Like they're somehow, but listen, the racism is pervasive. The racism is as pervasive at the elite level as it is at the common level. It takes different forms, but if you think that people like Larry Summers doesn't harbor the same stereotypes about Black people as anybody, even by the way, Black people, if you look at Barack Obama, he had this thing about Jews. He thought all Jews were geniuses. It's because he went through the liberal woke sectors of academia, Columbia and Harvard, and they all, they loved Barack Obama because he was a complete mediocrity, and it kind of consoled all of their prejudices. Like the very best Obama, they knew he was a kind of a zero. But if you look at Obama, he surrounded himself all with white Jews, all of them. It was almost embarrassing. I'll give you one example. He had 7 writers. He had a stable of writers, and all seven were white. You hear me? Now, he needed some comedy writers because, he would go to that gridiron dinner or whatever in Washington, those roasts.
Like the White House Correspondents' Dinner? Yeah.
Right. So he needed comedy right now. You're telling me there isn't one Black person who can write a joke?
Right.
But he himself had internalized all of the racism, and he only wanted to be surrounded by white folks, and in particular Jews. So at the elite level and at the common level, the racism is as thick. For me, the issue is not whether it exists, whether we have these demons loose inside of us. The question is, do you acquiesce to those demons, or do you fight them? Now, I don't engage in a struggle. Norman, interrupt your racism. Interrupt your racism. I don't do that. What I do is, if a student who is non-white, I had one student, a very smart guy. I'll name him because he's so smart. Lucan Sindaristo. So he took one of my classes on law. At the end of the class, at the end of the semester, he came up to me and just out of the blue, he just said, "Will you be my mentor?" Now, in all my years of teaching, which goes back before the Hills, nobody had ever done that. Now, Mr. Lukinson, if he's listening, he'll agree, is a very ambitious and very focused guy. At this point in life, he wants to be a federal judge. Okay? So, being his mentor is a full-time business. He will write me every day, not every day, every few days. He needs my help with this, my advice on that, my advice on that. Check out the courses I'm taking. What do you think of them? What do you think of this essay? And so forth. So whenever it sometimes gets weary, he'll forgive me, I'm an old man. I remember Professor Chomsky did that for me. Whenever I wrote, he got back to me in an hour. Whatever I wrote, he got back in an hour. If I wrote a book, it would take him 2 hours. And then it would be full of marginal comments. It was not a light read. He did a heavy read, a heavy duty read. And so that to me is how you fight racism. Not fighting your demons, making yourself available when people are trying to get a fair crack at life's happiness. And that's absolutely not what this white fragility is. One of the things that I found very useful, since you mentioned it a few moments ago, was the distinction that Adolf Reed and his son, Torrey Reed, and others in their circle the distinction they made, which had never occurred to me until I started to read them, between the old left goal of redistribution of wealth and the newfangled woke ending disparities. The old fashioned was Bernie Sanders, a vast redistribution of wealth. As Bernie said a couple of days ago, 3 people in our country own more wealth, 3 individuals own more wealth than the bottom 50%. 3 people own more wealth than the bottom 50%. And that was the goal of the old left, namely redistribution of wealth. The woke left, it's not a left, but I'll call it that. The woke left, what's their goal? Is one of the 3 people a lesbian cripple? That we have to make sure that among those 3 people, there's at least one lesbian cripple. It's not a problem that they have those 3 people have more wealth than the bottom 50%. We have to end the disparity, which means there has to be representation of every oppressed group among the ruling elite. And when they made that distinction, I have to say, there was a lot of clarity, because up until I started to write the book in cancel culture, I didn't realize there was a distinction between ending the disparity and ending the maldistribution of wealth. I thought they were the same. And then it became clear to me, having read them, what the real issue was. They don't want to end, they just want to be part of the haves. They don't want to enlarge the pie. They just want to make sure that they get 7 of the 8 slices of the pie.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's that is very well said. Got to clip that about making sure that one of the 3 is the lesbian cripple. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. And yeah, I just recommend that anybody wants to follow up on this, read the DiAngelo chapter of your book. I really did laugh a lot, while I was reading it.
You have to be very careful here.
But
please emphasize you laughed heartily.
Okay, fair enough. I did.
I just a brief anecdote.
Yeah.
As you know, Professor Chomsky was my mentor and my close friend for about 4 decades. Mm-hmm. And at the end of his life, obviously I called on him much less. He was much older and
sure,
he had higher priorities than me, rightfully so. But I did send him chapters from the cancel culture book.
Yeah.
And as I told you a moment ago, when he used to read my books, or chapters, whatever, it was very dense annotations. He was a very good mentor and critic.
Yeah.
But this, he kept writing back, which is totally out of character. He kept writing back, hilarious. It was a good feeling that I made the big Professor Chomsky laugh. I don't know if you know the story, but I got a lot of flack for that book when I was around as a manuscript. And people said, don't publish it. You're going to ruin your name. You're going to destroy yourself. I thought, oh, look, guys, I ruined my name and destroyed myself about 40 years ago. We're past that. But they were all telling me, don't publish it. Don't publish it. Especially the Robin DiAngelo chapter when I was using the black dialect. She'd be so chill. So I wrote Professor Chomsky, I said, Professor Chomsky, I really have to get your input because I'm really being torn apart by all the quite vicious criticism of the book. And so he writes back and he says, Norm, if you have any doubts about publishing the book, don't. So when I saw the don't, my heart collapsed because I thought he was saying, if you have
Don't
any doubt.
publish it. Yeah.
And then the next sentence wrote, of course you should publish it. So I take pride in the fact that there were two people who genuinely loved the book. And the two people were Professor Chomsky and, surprisingly, and I say this with a lot of respect,
Ugh.
Cornel West. Now, Cornel West is a real mind to reckon with. His range and depth is staggering. I came to realize that very belatedly because I was doing a very long interview with him, which alas was never published, but I did preparation for it. And I was overwhelmed by his range and depth of knowledge and detail. And the thing about Cornel West, he's like Chomsky. He's a very serious reader. And he said at one point, he was talking about my book. He said, Norman, those footnotes. Oh my Lord, those footnotes. And it was clear he read all the footnotes. He's a very serious reader, very impressive. So I figured, okay, if I have Professor Chomsky and Dr. West in my corner, F the rest of them.
Right. That seems right. Yeah, actually, so if I can, if I can just keep you for one more question on a different topic, one thing that I did want to pick your brain on quickly before we wrap up is that, so there are a few subjects in the subtitle of that book, right? And one of them is about, free speech, and right now, and of course, the biggest crackdown, you said earlier in the show today, right? You said that, we have been witnessing in this last year, one of the biggest crackdowns on free speech in American history. And some of the people who've been, bearing the brunt of it have been not the only people by any means, but some of them have been campus protesters. And now, of course, a lot of those people have just come back to school. The fall semester has just started, and and with any luck, I hope, right, certainly that the protests, about Gaza, really start again in earnest. And I just kind of, wanted to know what advice you would give those students about how to, how to resist as best they possibly could the sort of smear campaign and the crackdowns that, that have, certainly were going on at the end of the spring. And I expect to start right back up again, now as campus protests restart. And, particularly one thing that really hits me about this is that, as I need to tell you less than almost anybody, I think that, the left, or what passes for a left, has often, to its great detriment, in recent years, been pretty dismissive of the importance of free speech as a concept. And, I think, right, that part of that case now, right, has to be about, free speech, right? That as about, trying to simultaneously talk about the substance of the issue, but also, also talk about the campus protests as a free speech issue. Because, I think that itself can help build support for it right now. And so I just kind of wanted to get a very general sense of, what you would tell those students, or, what you are telling them as far as, what their message should be right now.
Well, of course, it's an important question. It has many aspects to it. I will address a few. First of all, I think it's going to be a very tough semester, a very tough academic year, because I think there were a lot of hard conversations this past summer between students and their parents about going forward. Columbia University, for example, is $80,000 a year, and students were suspended, students were expelled, students were denied the right to attend graduation. I'm sure a lot of students, their grades suffered significantly. You can't sit in an encampment 24/7 and expect to be acing your courses. Those are very hard decisions that these students made in the spring semester when they dedicated themselves to Gaza. And I suspect that, as I said, there were a lot of hard conversations with parents about going forward. And I suspect that's going to influence a lot of decisions, beginning with the new semester, about whether to participate and what degree of participation. And we have to bear in mind, it's not just suspensions, it's not just expulsions, it's not just denying the right to attend graduation, it's not just the arrest record. The other side is completely ruthless. These are I don't want to say Nazis, but they certainly have a Nazi mindset, in my opinion. They're saying we're hiring. It's a fact. I mean, we read about we're hiring outside organizations to check who participated in the encampments, and you're not going to join our law firm. You're not joining our law firm. So it's not just about the present; it's about the future. And given the level of sophistication of the technologies, the fact that you were in an encampment, you might have to carry that with you for 10 years, you know? So that's going to be tough. Number two, I've been asked this question many times, and my view is basically the same as yours. I think the best slogan should be Free Gaza, Free Speech. To Free Gaza / free speech. To join together those two issues so that some people may not agree with you about Gaza, but they will agree you have the right to speak your mind. You have the right to speak your mind. And a label shouldn't be affixed to you, like anti-Semite or Holocaust denier or whatever, because your opinion is different. So I think you can create a very large coalition if you join the two issues, with people having maybe doubts about the first, but no doubts about the second, free speech. So the slogan going forward should be free, in my opinion, free God / free speech. Number three, there's a section in my cancel culture book in which I predicted exactly what happened. I said that I could read it to you, but I'm not going to, I'll just summarize it. I said, if you start using the standard of hurt feelings, then if a Palestinian says, I don't want an Israeli soldier to speak on campus because that makes me feel unsafe, it hurts my feelings as a Palestinian, I said, that's going to backfire. I wrote it in the book. I used the example of Palestinians and the conflict. I said Israeli students are going to start saying, we don't feel safe. And it hurts our feelings when somebody chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Or when somebody says we support Hamas. So, but there's a very big difference. You know what the very big difference is? The other side has lots of money.
Right.
So they could say the Jewish students' feelings are hurt. They feel unsafe. So unless you repress the encampment, we're withholding $100 million. The Palestine students and their supporters don't have that leverage. And so now the Bill Ackmans, the Sternlichs, the Crafts, they are using that argument about feelings and safe spaces to crush any dissent, to nip it in the bud. Now, the oddest thing for me is in the midst of all of this nonsense about hurt feelings and feeling unsafe, everybody forgets our own history of free speech. Now, listen, Ben, I hope not that you remember, but you are aware
Mm-hmm.
that when the Nazis party wanted to march in Skokie, well, guess what? Skokie was a community of a large number of Holocaust survivors. They felt unsafe, they said. They said it revived memories of the Nazi Holocaust. And the ACLU defended the Nazi party and they marched. The courts held up their right. And that's always been considered a very proud moment in the history of the ACLU. Aria Nair, if my memory is correct, was the one who argued the case. He claims he's the son of Holocaust survivors, whether it's true, who knows. But the whole history of the defense of free speech, its landmark cases have been completely not just forgotten, but effaced. If the Nazi party can march through Skokie, Illinois, the home of a large community of Holocaust survivors, then why can't students chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? If you know the tradition, then it's a no-brainer that they have that right to chant that. I happen not to like the slogan, but I recognize they have the right to chant that slogan. They have the right to chant that slogan. And remember, they say, well, they're attacking the state of Israel. Has everybody forgotten that our Supreme Court upheld that you have the right to advocate the overthrow of the US government? Has everybody forgotten that? That long history of Supreme Court decisions finally upholding the principle that unless there is, the language constantly changed, but I don't feel the language is so important. Unless it's very clear and present danger that speech is going to result in the overthrow of the government, you have the right to say it, because the argument is that even though you disagree with the overthrow of the government, meaning the powers that be, there may be useful critiques contained in that program that we should hear. You know, it's the Millian argument, the John Stuart Mill argument, that you may not agree with overthrowing the government, but when they say they want to overthrow the government, they want to say because the capitalist system is this and the capitalist system is that, and so on and so on and so on, and that there may be useful arguments there. So even if they're advocating the overthrow, we should still listen. So if we as Americans have the right to advocate the overthrow of the government, then certainly Palestinians and their supporters have the right to advocate the dissolution of the state of Israel. You may not like it, but guess what? There are a lot of patriotic Americans who don't like the idea of overthrowing the government.
Right.
But you have that right. So that whole history of defense of free speech, it went out the window But regrettably, the door was opened by the woke culture with all the talk about hurt feelings and safe spaces and blah, 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 blah. They paved the way to the catastrophe that befell the college campuses in the spring and probably will be much worse in the fall.
Yeah. And, and of course people always say, oh, they would have done it anyway. But I always, this always drives me crazy because
you don't make it easy for them. You don't hand it to them in a silver platter.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You don't have to, the fact that your enemies are going to try to do something doesn't mean that you should, that it's like fine for you to do things that make it easier for them to do it. Right. Yeah.
I mean, we could have had a real argument like the one I'm trying to present now. The Skokie example, the overthrow of the government example. We had cases in the court where people, a fellow came to court wearing a T-shirt saying "fuck the draft,"
right,
and his right was preserved. Remember, our rights included the right to burn the flag. It was called expressive speech. You had the right because you were making a statement by burning the flag, so it was protected. Expressive speech. That was during the war in Vietnam. So we had a whole rich tradition that we could have argued with. It was very striking to me when President Shafiq went before that clown committee in the House. Somebody commented it was a very sharp remark. Very sharp remark. I wish I had said it. He said, "Do you know what the only two words that never passed her lips when she went before the committee? Two words never passed her lips. Academic freedom."
Right.
Completely jettisoned it. Let it go.
Yeah.
It's pathetic.
Well, yeah, I think that's I think that it's this giant strategic blunder, and certainly those of us who would see ourselves as representing, that kind of old left tradition, I think that if the basis of your politics is thinking that, ordinary working class people, have the capacity to, take over society, can certainly govern themselves, you can't believe that they're so stupid they have to be protected, from wrong think. So
I'm protected by Robin DiAngelo.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which certainly the person you want is the adjudicator of ideas. All right, Norm, it is a great pleasure as always. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
All right. So as Norm Finkelstein, again, his book, for anybody who hasn't read it yet, is I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom. Always a pleasure to have him on the show. But now I want to switch gears to the other front in the war against bullshit. And actually, let's before we bring Matt on, let's play him on with some thoughts from Mr. Kirk.
It is book launch week for us. Here on the Charlie Kirk Show, we worked very, very hard on this book. Right-Wing Revolution is out. How to Beat the Woke and Save the West. I think it is one of the most important things I have done and we have published. You guys can get your copy right now. We're going to be speaking about it all hour. You can get it at 45books.com. That is the number 45books.com. Let's show it up on screen, guys. I know someone's running me a copy over here, but let's understand this, is that the woke or the race Marxists or the Marxists, they seem to control everything. One of the most common questions we get is, what can I do to help? Right-Wing Revolution is our full answer to that question. The slogan of our movement is Make America Great Again, and Right-Wing Revolution digs deep into what every person can do to make that slogan a reality. whether that you are a newly elected lawmaker, you're a new parent, or if you're just a citizen looking to fight. At Right-Wing Revolution, we recognize that any great political transformation first requires a transformation of the self. This isn't just a list of policies we should implement or laws we should pass, although it does have those in great detail. This is a book that explains how you can change your very outlook on life in order to resist left-wing intellectual poisons and hold firm against their efforts to dominate and control you.
All right. So we're joined by Matt McManus, who I know has actually read this book. In fact, I read his review of it. But having read it, I just want to know if it works as advertised. Did your mind stay clean of left-wing intellectual poisons?
Well, I do have to say that if that's Charlie Kirk at his best and he worked really hard at it, then I have no idea what Charlie Kirk taking an off day or just phoning it in would look like, right? At that point, it probably wouldn't even have a color cover. It would just be a fucking piece of toilet paper handed out to whoever happens to be coming by, being like, here you go. This is what you'll need for a right-wing revolution. I will say, if what you're trying to do is get into the mindset of Charlie Kirk and figure out how you could pretty much do what Charlie Kirk would want you to do at any given time, it's not a bad book. But why you should do what Charlie Kirk wants you to do is something that's never really answered in it. And I can just very bluntly say to you, don't do what Charlie Kirk wants you to do. You're going to end up in a bad place, and you're going to end up writing books like Right-Wing Revolution. And believe me, nobody wants that embarrassment hanging over their head.
Yeah, I mean, it does really strike me, even just watching that clip, that it's funny, right? Because just talk to Norm Finkelstein, who obviously has a very sharp critique of at least some of the things that are usually meant by wokeness, identity politics,
Sure.
Cancel culture, right? And but like, all of which is just to say there are better and worse versions of objections to those things.
Sure.
I would go so far as to say that it's like, look, I mean, forgetting Norm for a second, I mean, even just go into Charlie's portion of the political spectrum, there are better and worse conservative objections to those things, right? There are a range of, conservative views and arguments I can read that, I'm not going to agree with any of it, but at least like it can, that can make me think harder about my assumptions, etc. But like, even just listening to that 90 seconds that we just listened to, like, I don't know what Charlie means by wokeness. And, it has something to do with Marxists controlling everything.
Well, doesn't it always, right? Now, look, when I published this, there were at least a few angry-ish conservatives who wrote to me being like, look, not everybody can be Roger Scruton. Not everyone can be Patrick Deneen. Not everybody can be, Michael Oakeshott. Why are you aspiring to that?
Okay, but I mean, like, if I don't, I mean, if I can't play chess like Garry Kasparov, I'm at least not going to like swallow any of the pieces.
Oh yeah, no, but that's the thing. I mean, I've read a lot of trash fire conservative books, right? And reading Right-Wing Revolution by Charlie Kirk just made me long desperately for like the impartiality and the sober realism of Ben Shapiro, right? Like I sat there thinking to myself, God, I remember the days when I read, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps by Ben Shapiro, and just how lucid it was and how he carefully went through making certain kinds of definitions. I even sat there thinking about Chris Rufo's book, right? America's Cultural Revolution, that I reviewed with Nathan Robinson, being like, Chris is just such a deep philosophical mind. And I really miss his takes on things like Marcuse and Baudrillard and all that stuff. I can't understand how the bottom just keeps getting lower and lower every time. Like, it reminds me of that old Robin Williams joke that I think I actually used in the review, right? With Charlie Kirk, you just fucking debase your standards quicker than you can lower them somehow. And they started at a very low place, right? We were like down here, and whether it's his audience sitting there being like, no, we can get lower than that, or Charlie just being like, fuck me, I'm lazy. Right down, and you're going to eat it, pigs. I have no idea, right? But even by the standards of conservative punditry, this is really, really, really bad, right? If you are a right-winger listening to this, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, for God's sake, is a mental giant next to Charlie Kirk, right? And Dave Rubin is somebody who has so little thought in his head that people are willing to take phone calls in conversation with him. And he makes, Charlie Kirk look like fucking, next to Charlie Kirk, Dave Rubin looks like Michael Oakeshott.
Well, I do definitely want to get to what in Right-Wing Revolution inspired that assessment, but something clear as I was preparing.
I'd also like to point out, just give me 1 second.
Sure, please. Yeah. Oh no. All right. Well, I should say, while Matt is doing whatever he's taking his 1 second to do.
Okay. So I would like to point out that I have gone through not one, not two, but 3 of Charlie's books. And when I said the standard has dropped, right, even relative to his older work, I was like, fuck me, this is lazy, right? Like when you read this, you're like, this is like a 2 out of 10 book, right? This is like watching your average Michael Bay movie. Then you get to this and you're kind of like, oh, so apparently Marx was the president of the young Hegelians. How interesting, right? So now we're really getting, late night, you're really drunk, that kind of level of movie. And then somehow he was like, no, this is just the fucking warm up to this text where I'm going to give you a list of books that you should read. I won't have read them, but I'm still going to call you fucking lazy for not having gone through it. And you're just going to have to deal with it. Like I said, the group that should be the most insulted by the existence of this are conservatives. Because if I were a fucking conservative reading through this book where he sits there being like, what I'm doing is a process of friendly deception and encouraging you to police your own thoughts so that there's no uncertainty in them, I'd be like, okay, so what you're suggesting is that in order to accept this trash, I need to be a fucking idiot. And apparently you're encouraging me to make myself stupider to swallow that. And if I were a conservative, I'd be like, I'm just not going to do that, Charlie. Again, I'm going to go back to good old Dave Rubin and good old Ben Shapiro, because at least they're not asking me to fucking drink bleach to lower my IQ enough so that I can swallow whatever it is that they're trying to sell. They're just content with aiming at the bottom of their respective barrels.
Well, in fact, last night and this morning, I did read all 3 of your reviews of the Charlie Kirk trilogy. Which I suspect I would not enjoy reading the books themselves, but
I suspect not.
I certainly enjoyed reading the reviews. In fact, I think I mentioned, I think I mentioned to you off air, I was in my parents' place in Beaumont last night, and I was sitting in the kitchen after they'd gone to bed, and I was reading a couple of these, and at one point I started laughing so loud that my dad came out of his bedroom to ask what I was laughing at. But in any case, so this is the first one, the Maga doctrine. The only ideas that will win the future. Now, I suppose I will give him credit for the choice of cover art. That's a fun decision. It's I wonder about it, but so you reviewed this for REO magazine, and you note at the beginning that this is kind of a funny combination of words, right? The Maga doctrine, because when you think about Donald Trump, who in a horrible sort of way, I mean, it's certainly impressive. I mean, that the personality of this one sort of strange elderly racist has completely rewired American politics, so everything has revolved around him for the last decade.
I know, and I want to say I was at the DNC with a buddy of mine. We were doing interviews for things, and I disagreed with a lot of what was said, but the one thing Obama noted that I completely agreed with was when he was like, isn't this whole Trump thing just getting a little bit old? And as somebody who's been reading these books and writing about it for the better part of a decade now, I was like, yeah, fuck. more than anything else now just want Donald Trump to go, just so that I can be spared having to think about him any longer, right? He's like that party guest that nobody wanted to show up, who crashed a party. Everyone just kind of tolerated him. Then you threw him out, but now he's coming back in. And at some point or another, you're just like, the cops are just going to have to be called, man. You're drunk. Get out of here.
Yeah. I mean, again, the fact that it has been literally almost a decade, right? That I mean, and whatever. I mean, he was a major figure certainly well before that, but it has been, but like it has been a good 9 years and change since Donald Trump started his first race for president. And in a very real way, for that whole 9 years, I mean, like all of American political discourse, I mean, is just like everything always revolves around the son of like Donald Trump, pro or con, which is, yes, it's exhausting. I will acknowledge that in a sense it is very impressive, right? That he's like he's a master of something, right?
Yep.
Clearly. But one thing that is not a word you would normally associate with him is doctrine, since the guy, has like whatever his skills as a demagogue, insult comedian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't really seem like an ideas guy. And in fact, I don't know. I mean, if you look at what he actually did when he was in office for 4 years, it seems like, except for some, some like extra performative cruelty at the border, and with immigrants and Muslim travelers, pretty much everything he did is just like more or less what Republicans do, right? So it doesn't really seem like there's anything ideologically novel about this. But then you can't admit that, or else as like a big Trump guy, like once you've admitted that, it's like, well, okay, so if there's nothing ideologically distinctive about him, then isn't this just a cult of personality, right? I mean, like what's the, like what could possibly justify Trump being this big a deal to his followers? If not, so therefore there must be some kind of doctrine, and Charlie Kirk in the first installment of the trilogy is there to fill that gap. So, lay it on me. What's the, like what are the ideas of Donald Trump as Charlie Kirk sees them?
Well, I don't think that you're wrong to assume that they're more or less just whatever impulses Donald Trump happens to have at any given point, and that more or less just happens to be with whatever the conservative movement wants at any given point. And this is one of the things that really comes through when you read Kirk's book, and I'll get into my analysis of why this is significant later on. But if you read somebody, again, like Ben Shapiro has some pretty clearly thought out principles that he holds to. Now, he doesn't think through them all that deeply.
Sure.
But if you read, the right side of history, he kind of buys into this quasi-Straussian idea of, Western civilization is predicated on Athens and Jerusalem, and we need to be committed to both of those at the same time, which leads to classical liberal conclusions with some social conservative flourishes, right? You can read fucking Dave Rubin's book again, and he's kind of a libertarian, except when he wants to, toy around with some light fascism, here and there. But there's a kind of consistent through line there. Kirk very clearly just isn't interested very much in ideas at all, right? Even though he apparently decides he wants to write books that argue for things like a Maga doctrine. What he'll just do is he'll kind of coagulate all the different impulses, prejudices, and pathologies that are latent or expressed in the Republican and the Maga movement at any given time. And he tries to provide a surface justification for all of them without any real effort to try to interrogate whether these things fit together or even really whether they make a great deal of sense together, right? Now, this was less problematic in the Maga doctrine, where every now and then he would say things like, for the most part, I'm a libertarian, but at least kind of acknowledging that there might be a tension following the but, right? By the time you get to right-wing revolution, there's just none of that, right? It's like, well, we should be really fiercely defending free speech against the woke Marxist left. But pornographers, they're not really engaged in free speech, and so we can silence them, right? We should really be committed to this idea of free movement of peoples wherever possible. But we should also have a really strong border, right? Because that's an important thing. we need to, get back in touch with the muscle class, as he calls them, these good working class guys. But the Democrats are clearly the party of the losers and those who don't really want to work for a living. And also, we have to recognize that billionaires are the ones that create all the jobs in this country. And we should, if anything, thank them for that, right? This is also in the college scam a little bit. So I'm kind of assimilating the two books together. So it's really frustrating reading these books in a way that I cannot express to someone really unless they've also gone through them, which I don't recommend, right? Because what you get the sense is of somebody who is just trying to give a justification for all these things. And any normal, reasonably smart person would recognize that there's deep incongruities there and at least acknowledge that. But Kirk just doesn't care very much, right? He just sweeps all those anxieties aside and is like, look, this is what the movement believes. This is what they want. And this is what I'm going to sell. And that's a segue to what I'm going to talk about later on, which is that at a key point in the right-wing revolution, he does actually have some interesting things to say that are, if you want to call it that, original or demonstrate some real thought on his part, but they're not actually about politics, let alone the substance of things like political ideologies or policy. It's about how to market and pitch things. And that, I think, is what Kirk is good at.
Yeah, which I suppose is also the thing that, where Trump's genius is. But although I think he's also losing his touch this time around. But in any case, it happens, to the best of us.
I mean, I can't even remember. What does he call Kamala now? There's like Communist Kamala or Commie Kamala or something.
The last one I remember was Cackling Kamala, which I've got to say, I actually think that's a mistake because, whereas, Kamala does have a bit of a manic laugh, not nearly as bad as, for example, Trump's friend Tucker. But whatever. She does have a bit of a manic laugh, but I have to say, coming from Trump,
those are 6 out of 10.
Yeah. Well, it's also like, okay, like it seems like what you're doing is just reminding us that Kamala is somebody who often laughs, which is a thing that Trump just does not do, right? Like ever. And if you're somebody who never ever laughs, I wouldn't call attention to that. Because that I think the more people think about that, the less appealing that seems on a human level.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's something we could talk about later also, because I think there's some significance to that difference. I was just making the much more glib point that, I mean, if you think about Trump during, let's just use rock music metaphor, his imperial phase, right? He was just like running with the classics one after another, right? Crooked Hillary, Little Marco.
Oh my God, he was so good at it. Yeah,
like
low energy Jeb Bush.
Yeah, exactly. Low energy Jeb, right? Then you get to like 2020, bud. Like, sorry, 2024, Trump, 2023. Ron DeSanctimonious. You're like, okay, that's not quite up to par.
Kind of funny, but it's not. Yeah. It's not really. It's not like it's not anything like Little Marco.
No, it's like the Rolling Stones during their Some Girls.
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like a great Stones album. In a lot of ways, it's pretty good, but it's just not quite the classic that you're looking for. And now we're getting this, and it's just very disappointing, right?
Yeah. So one of the things we point out is that when he tries to define the Maga doctrine, it just sounds like he's describing libertarianism, and which of course is very strange because the least look, there is lots of overlap between Republican policy preferences and libertarianism, of course, right? Like but the least libertarian thing in the world is to say we need to build a giant wall and throw as many people as possible in cages so they can't move around from place to place without our permission. Which you even bring in, Jason Brennan, certainly not my favorite guy, but, much more consistent, than Charlie Kirk, who's a libertarian philosopher, to talk about this. And, in general, I mean, it does hit me. I mean, certainly from my own debate with Kirk a few years ago that, he justifies his view on immigration, partly in terms of, the sort of threat of, cheap labor to, the living standards of American workers. But of course, this is the only thing that he wants to do at a policy level to help American workers, which seems odd.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And those kinds of contradictions again pervade right-wing revolution, and they mean bluntly they pervade all his work, right? Just read again the college scam. It opens with the very typical kind of Maga stuff about over-intellectualized, nebbish liberal elites who've never done a hard day's work in their life, and a kind of hagiography of what he calls the muscle class, right? People who work with their hands, which is ironic again, because, Kirk has never done anything like that his entire life. And if he valorizes it so much, then by all means, he can go work in a factory and, get some real life experience that way. But, later on,
not extensively, but it's like, look, I have had manual labor jobs. They, I didn't particularly enjoy it. There's a reason that, there's a reason I didn't stick with it. Right. But it's, but I actually find it almost impressive in a weird way that, you could, not go to college, as Kirk famously did not. He makes a very big deal of that. And also just have got to be an adult without ever having a real job. I guess he was just swept up by the right wing, the right wing money machine, so early in his arc that, he didn't have to.
Oh yeah, and what's even more embarrassing about it is, for somebody who never went to college, he sure spent a lot of time, well into his 30s now, talking about college, ruminating about college, commenting on the college experience, you name it. He's kind of like that kid at this point who's well into adulthood and still complaining about high school. It's like, I get it, man. It's over, right? It's time to move on and to try to do something that looks a little bit like being an adult, rather than building websites tattling on college professors that you don't like. But that just might be a little bit too mature for Kirk. In Right-Wing Revolution, he characterizes himself as a young punk at one point. And I do have to say, I spent my time around some young punks, and I can't remember any of them who were like, what we stand for? More police powers, loving billionaires and appreciating them, and above all else, right? We're big Donald Trump people because we just love ourselves some real estate moguls, right? I don't know how many punks Kirk has actually ever hung out with, but that doesn't usually tend to be their motif. But again, I think that one of the reasons he's doing this is because he understands that it's good marketing, and we'll get into that as being really Kirk's singular talent in life. But in terms of, again, the ideological consistencies in all these books, they abound, right? Kirk will praise the muscle class at one point without ever having actually done any of those jobs that he claims are the ones that bring a lot of value to society, at least at some points. And then the next point, I'll talk about how it's billionaires that actually do rate all the jobs in this country, how we should be very thankful for them, how we shouldn't disincentivize them. And he'll lampoon the Democratic Party for looking after the losers in society who can't make it on their own grid, right?
Yeah, this is I think actually a pretty common right-wing thing, that the Kirk thing about the muscle class is oh, I'm not an elitist, so I think that's just great that these people are doing those jobs, which of course is a very different thing from I want to do anything whatsoever to help people who are doing those jobs, right? This is something I remember, really hit me many years ago when, there's this girl I went to graduate school with who was a, libertarian who I got into a big argument about this about.
And that's less surprising. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. I'd had, I got into this big argument with her about because she'd posted this meme that was like, oh, you want that higher minimum wage at McDonald's, and and there was a picture of the order machine. It was like, meet your replacement, and we got into it and we were arguing about it, and she said, and there was one point where it's okay, she was a moderate libertarian, and she was okay with a UBI. Some libertarians like that, right? And and I was pointing out, I was like, look, if you had like a real UBI that you could actually live on, I don't know if that's what you're talking about, like McDonald's wouldn't exist. I mean, this is something that people are only going to do if they're desperate. And I remember at that point, the move was, oh, see, this is how leftists are. They actually look down on these like, real, working class jobs. Like, no, I don't look down on anybody for doing it. It's just a fact that working at McDonald's is fucking awful. Like, and nobody does that if they can help it. Right. Like,
I often tell people, I worked at McDonald's for, I guess, about a year and a half when I was in high school. Second worst job I ever had, actually. But actually, it was a formative experience for me because one of the reasons I started transitioning left on economic issues, right, was because there was a woman there. She was probably about 40. I won't say her name in case she ever hears this, right? But, we were all young. We goofed around. A lot of people smoked weed and worked, that kind of thing.
Sure.
She was always pretty solid about things. And one day I talked to her about things. We were on shift together. And she was like, I just feel so happy being around you people. You make me feel young again because I realize that I'm going to die here. Like, as in working at that place. And I was very immature, right? I was only about like 14, 15. And I kind of had to really extrapolate it a little bit. But I was like, I've been here for a couple months and I fucking hate it, right? The number of times I've been sent out into a dumpster to pick shit up because people throw things in the trash that they're not supposed to, and I got to go die for it. It just sucks. But in the back of my mind, I always thought, like, I'm getting the hell out of here. I'm not staying, right?
Sure.
And, maybe I had a kind of an elitist attitude about that in some senses, right? And, it's kind of like, I'm too good for this. I'm not going to stay here. But what occurred to me after this is I'm like, my God, I had to be this woman. That would really suck. And I don't think people should be put into that kind of situation. It's a really fucking shitty situation. We shouldn't have a society where people are forced to choose to do these jobs for 20, 30, 40 years and still be hanging out with high school students, trying to make a couple extra bucks to buy movies and stuff at the Rogers and to save up for some trips and stuff. But she's doing it because she has to put food on, the plate for her family because she lives in a trailer home. It's really fucking revealing if you ever actually do some of those things, how many problems there are in society. And that's why I think, it is telling that Kirk lionizes these people, but it's very clear that he's never actually really spent a great deal of time with anybody who actually has worked any of these jobs. Might give them a bit of a mouthful about just what they think the government should be doing on their behalf.
Yeah, no, exactly. Or, perhaps they could get paid days off as are legally mandated in every other first world country and quite a few of the third world ones. Which we don't
in this
have.
country, they could even get fucking healthcare that's halfway decent, right? I mean, at least in Canada, we had that, right? If you got burned or you weren't able to work, you could go to the hospital, right? Fuck, I don't even know what health insurance is like if you work at McDonald's right now, but I'm betting it's not good.
Yeah, that would be my guess. But yeah, so when you think about your intention to get out of that, of course, that had to do with going to college, which brings us to the book you already mentioned, the number 2 in the trilogy and the Empire Strikes Back position, the college scam.
I'm sorry. This book is more like a Nightmare on Elm Street 2, right? Again, I don't mean to imply that, the Maga doctrine is anywhere on par with Wes Craven's masterpiece, right? But it is it's fucking Plato next to the college scam, right? Let's just be very clear, right?
Well,
laziness creeped in quick and hard.
Well, okay, so I do want to talk about Plato because in your review, also an ario of College Scam, it's called Marx's Professors and Brainwashed Students, Charlie Kirk's The College Scam. I think actually, one of those times that I was laughing that hard last night was when I got to the point where you're talking about how like the anti-college memoir is this venerable conservative tradition. William F. Buckley wrote one, right? God and Man at Yale, which, I don't subject myself to this stuff anything like the way that you do, but, every, I do try once a year or so to, get myself to read a conservative book just to kind of stay honest. And,
my inner Catholic, right? You got to get the self-flagellation in at some point.
So I have read God and Man at Yale, and it's, in fact, I actually remember I read it right after the last conservative book I read before that was Ben Shapiro's The Right Side of History. And I've got to say that like really primed me to enjoy the Buckley book since, it's like certainly if nothing else, the writing is like 10,000 times better than Shapiro, and also I don't think Buckley would say things like Shapiro says in that book that Kant located morality in the human heart,
Yeah.
actual quote.
That legendary figure who was just like, we need to really base morality very heavily on our emotions and what's emotionally gratifying.
Yep. As much as possible. That was Kant's main point. Yep.
Yeah. Almost went too far with that, right?
Exactly. But, and got him out at Yale, by the way, is interesting because it's, just to connect the topics from tonight, it's a very, very openly pro-censorship book.
Which is almost refreshing when you read it, right? Because at least you're like, look, normally you have to kind of wade through these layers of bullshit and obfuscation, and Kirk saying like, I'm a libertarian, but at least with Buckley you get no holds barred, unfiltered conservatism in the sense that is, look, rights belong to some people, not to others, and I think that for the most part we should have speech unless you don't deserve it, or you're going to undermine values that I think are important. In those cases, you don't deserve speech. And you're like, right. At least he might be a bullshitter, but at least he's honest, right? He's an honest bullshitter in some bizarre sense of the word.
Yeah, exactly. Like Buckley's just gonna be like, oh, Yale needs to fire all of these atheists and socialists from its faculty. So it's this venerable tradition. You've got Buckley, you've got Dinesh D'Souza, you've got whatever. Like there's a
Alan
long
Bloom, there's so
Alan
many.
Bloom, right? Totally, yeah. That one's also one that what I enjoyed most in that one is his actually, if you had to guess, like what stood out to me from Alan Bloom.
I would say that what stood out for you in Alan Bloom's The Closing American Mind was the long and very homoerotic sequence where he's talking about Mick Jagger's gyrating.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah. It's unforgettable, right? Like,
his abiding hatred of Mick Jagger and his strange psychosexual, whatever was going on there, is definitely what's memorable in that book. But you point out in this passage, it's like, okay, all of these conservatives have written their anti-college memoirs, about how college is a terrible place. Charlie Kirk is really an innovator because he's the first one in this whole line who's refreshed the genre by a new twist, which is he wrote this despite not actually skipping the going to college part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he's really innovative in a lot of ways in that sense, right? He's also somebody who will give book recommendations and then acknowledge that he's never actually read any of those books, or at least hasn't read a lot of them, right? So offer conservatives advice about how to navigate their way through college without ever actually going to college. Talk about books that he hasn't actually read. Like I said, he's like a kid in a Noah Baumbach film, right? Where he kind of gets the feel of what these books are about, and he kind of gets the feel for what college is about, and that's enough, right? Actually going to college, that sounds like a lot of work, and you might pick up some ideas that could poison your mind, right? You got to police your thoughts. That's his term. You got to police your thoughts really carefully. In the same way, if you were to read some books by people like George Orwell or Leo Tolstoy, could be that you might pick up some stuff that endorses democratic socialism or Christian anarchism and all that stuff. And you got to avoid that. Best thing to do is not read those texts. Yeah, recommend them, but don't read them.
Yes, recommend, don't read. Okay, well, this does, of course, at last take us to the triumphant conclusion of the trilogy. Right-wing revolution, how to beat the woke and save the West, and your review of it in Sublation, beating the woke by friendly deception, has one of my all-time opening paragraphs of a review. Charlie Kirk's Right-Wing Revolution is written by a man with so little respect for the Western canon that, rather like an anxious high schooler in a Noah Baumbach film, Charlie offers a list of recommended books to learn about our shared Western heritage before admitting that he has, quote, definitely not read, unquote, all of his own recommendations. Apparently, he respects the idea of the West, but not enough to read anything about the content he himself insists the lazy masses should take the time to learn about. As I'll make clear, the only
and I want to
thing...
make clear that's not me being unfair, right? Like I said, it's pretty clear that Kirk probably hasn't read Bronze Age Mindset, but he's a little jealous of BAP and, you know, all the intellectual prestige he's going through. So there's a lot more like, you got to get swole, you got to get, you know, tough. People are lazy and decadent, and that includes right wingers. And we got to, you know, kick yourself off the video game machine and actually spend some time reading these books' attitudes all throughout it. And it's one of those circumstances where you're like, I don't know, Charlie, I think that would resonate a lot more if you actually read your fucking own book list, right? Can't sit there being like, you lazy fucks spend all your time on social media. You should sit down and fucking read a book. But I'm not going to do it because, you know, I run a vast media empire, but I like the sound of these books.
Yeah. I mean, we have here Charlie Kirk's starting point for serious reading about our shared Western heritage. You know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, you know, famously Elon Musk, by the way, recently read one of those, although he seems to be a little bit confused about which one. The Divine Comedy, a whole thing, not just the Inferno. Emma by Jane Austen, the complete works of William Shakespeare. So, you know, you must read Titus Andronicus, like, you know, everything, right? Now
every sonnet that he's ever put down, you got to go through it.
Yeah. Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, War and Peace by Tolstoy, 39 Steps by John Buchan, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, 1984 by George Orwell.
Of course.
And, you know, of course, you know, if you don't have, you know, again, it is sublime that Charlie says in the book that he hasn't read all of his own reading list, which makes you wonder, why is that the reading list? Why couldn't you just give us a reading list of books that you did read all of? Surely that's, you know, surely you could dip into your extensive reading and, you know, give us, you know, maybe it'll be shorter. That's okay. Right. Just yeah. give us the Western heritage reading list that you actually read. Right. Why not? You know, I just can't think why he didn't do that. But like, all right, there's a lot, right? You know, you might, you know, complete works of William Shakespeare is very long, right? Yeah. And honestly, I think that, you know,
I mean,
they're not all Lear and Hamlet, right? But like,
I've often said to people, I would probably bring that book to my desert island, precisely because there's no fucking way in hell that I'm ever going to read a fraction of all the plays of Shakespeare. Like, I've read my fair share of Shakespeare plays. Right? It's actually a very rewarding experience if you go through them slowly and carefully. I had a class at grad school where we did just that, right? But there's so much, right, that I was like, well, if I ever get with Shannon Island, I'll read that and I can go through them time and time again. It'll be pretty much inexhaustible, right? But anyway, sorry, go on.
Well, I mean, as you point out, some of these authors are interesting as Charlie Kirk recommendations. And I would just say, if you don't have time to read all of this, as Charlie himself self-admittedly does not, you know, you could look into some shorter things by some of these same authors. So, for example, the last one on there, the last author on the list, George Orwell. You know, if you can't, you know, if you don't have a weekend clear to read 1984, you could at least set aside an evening and read his short essay, Why I Write, in which you will encounter the line, every serious line I've written since 1936 has been in some way written against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. But I don't know.
You can read The Road to Wigan Pier, where he's even more blunt about it, where it's like, there are some points where I just think that democratic socialism is such elementary common sense that I'm surprised it hasn't instituted itself already, right? Which is a brilliant line, and also an attitude I wish more leftists would take, right? But anyway.
Totally. Yeah, right. But again, this is kind of, I don't remember who I'm stealing this from, but I mean, like, this just the kind of thing that makes me, you know, it's not fair at every instance, but it's fair in a lot of them, right? You know, that line about how to be a conservative is to love and revere the Western tradition, but not actually know much of anything about it.
No, that's exactly it, right? So in the review, I point out that Kirk is a very pure kind of postmodern conservative. Interesting enough, once upon a time, I thought that this term was just kind of an unreflective one that I was applying to people who didn't actually self-consciously embody those doctrines. And then I read an interview with Chris Rufo, who again is like a smarter, more sophisticated Charlie Kirk. And he was like, look, we live in a postmodern moment. In this postmodern moment, affect, knowledge, and information are the kind of currency that you need in order to develop narratives. And he who can do that very successfully is going to be politically extremely effective, right? That's paraphrasing. And I was kind of like, gosh, right? Here's somebody who actually seems to self-consciously agree with this kind of postmodern conservative mentality. But, you know, in Kirk's case, what becomes very clear is that he thinks about the entire world less in terms of the substance of things like Western culture or the substance of things like Christianity, and far more in terms of marketing, narrative, affect, right? And this is very much in keeping with what you're talking about, right? The substance of Western civilization is extremely rich, extremely diverse, and it would include traditions like, say, socialism and Marxism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or it would include Christian anarchism, a la people like Leo Tolstoy, who was one of the most fierce anti-conservatives that you can imagine, right? But he's not interested in that, right? What he's interested in is the brand Western civilization, because it's easy to pitch the brand Western civilization to conservatives that like to feel that they are part of something that elevates them above other civilizations, so-called, around the globe. And they don't really care very much about what the content is of that civilization, let alone the tensions are within it, as long as they feel that sense of elevation. And you see this, again, pervasive throughout the text. The most interesting part of the book, the one part where I really thought Charlie actually seems to have some interesting thoughts about this, where again, when he was talking about marketing, and you can tell that he's really taking his time with this because he's genuinely knows what he's talking about, A, but B, also he has some pretty sophisticated things to say about it, where he says, look, Americans above all else are great at the pitch and they're great at marketing. He says, we love marketing so much in America that we sometimes like commercials more than the actual products that they're selling, right? And he talks about Geico ads, for example, which is true, right? I was like, immediately,
Sure.
I thought to myself, like, I do remember those Geico ads. I've never bought a Geico anything. So points to him there. And he says, look, we need to apply the principles of marketing and pitching and framing to politics. And this means, in his words, that you aim for the simplest narrative that you can ever possibly can. You get rid of all complexity. And in his terms, you chase black and white, good and evil, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader on every issue possible. Even if you happen to be uncertain about whether conservatives are right, you can know that leftists are wrong. And you should, again, in his own term, police your thoughts to get rid of any ambiguities that you might have about whether we're the right team. And what's really remarkable about this is, as I point out, I was feeling a bit greedy when I wrote this. If you watch the original Star Wars trilogy, which I'm not sure Kirk really has, you'd know. Well, actually, the Luke Darth Vader stuff gets pretty complicated by the end, by the standards of like a pop, like trilogy. You know, Vader eventually redeems himself, kills the Emperor, at least for a while. And, Luke struggles with the dark side and ambiguity about, the Jedi. So what Kirk is really saying here is that we need a sub-Star Wars level of complexity for conservatives to actually function as, kind of viable ideological movement. And that's why I said at the start of my book that there's nothing more insulting to the average conservative, ironically, than right-wing revolution. Because when you're essentially arguing that what we're all about is marketing and framing and branding, no substance, we need people to police their thoughts so that any complexity doesn't enter into them. What you're really saying is what makes conservative function is some abulant people, right? People who just don't think too much about things. And if they do start to feel hints of thoughts rising into their head, they push that shit down, right? And if that's what your political movement is about, a kind of self-conscious embrace of thoughtlessness and stupidity, then boy, oh boy, should you be ashamed to belong to that movement. And if that's what conservatism has really come to, a la Kirk, if I were conservative, I would want no part of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you imagine that you wrote a movie where the conservative guy in the movie was like constantly telling his followers, hey, you need to police your thoughts to make sure that no liberal thoughts enter into your head, and see every issue with the simplicity of Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader.
But only in the first film, right? You know, once you start getting into like Empire Strikes Back level territory, that's getting a little bit too complicated. Like we've reached the level of 8-year-olds in terms of like their moral nuance and
No, I mean,
thinking. Can't
I
have
love
that.
that. I love that. Yeah, I mean, people would think it's like, oh my God, this is such a ridiculous caricature of conservatives. Like, this is so unfair. And yeah, I love that line in the review about actually, you know, actually what he's preaching. If you think about it, is a sub Star Wars level of complexity. Because look, I was a small child in the 1980s. I watched those, you know, VHSs of the original trilogy
Me too.
innumerable times, right? And I have like a very deep store of love and affection for those movies in my soul. I try not to think about the existence of all the rest of the movies that were made in that franchise afterwards, but
you and like 3/4 of the Star Wars fandom at this point, right? So.
I will say, in my more reflective moments, despite having this massive bias in favor of these movies, it has occurred to me that's like, man, George Lucas has a really simplistic view about like human beings and their motivations and all that stuff. It's like, you know, everybody's kind of good or evil and they flip on a dime, you know, from being one to the other. But it's like, no, not simplistic enough, apparently.
Yeah. Again, that's why I said at the beginning of this, Charlie seems to be, to quote the old Robin Williams joke, one of those guys who's like, however low my standard is, I'm going to fucking break it and go lower immediately, right? Break my standards quicker than I can lower them. Because when you're sitting there being like, we need something that is more simple than The Empire Strikes Back, because that's too much moral ambiguity for people to deal with in the conservative movement, then boy, oh boy, what does that say about what he thinks of his own audience, right? And it's really telling that when he's talking about marketing, he describes it at some point as a form of friendly deception in his term, right? And to me, that's quite revealing, right? Call it a Freudian slip if you want. It's like, so that seems to almost be a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that what you're talking about here is a kind of deception, right? And the only way it's going to work is for people to police their own thoughts sufficiently so they don't realize just how bizarre what you're proposing is. Because it's really weird, man. Like you read this book and you're like, fuck me, right? Like the last third of Right Wing Revolution could basically be boiled down to just drop and do 50, and then after that, don't watch porn, because if you watch porn, the Marxists are going to win, right?
That was another point. So, okay, so that clip that we watched earlier, Charlie says that, of course, we're not just talking about policies, we're also talking about what you can do.
That's right.
And we were watching that. You know, we were trying to like figure out what clip to use for when we to introduce the book in the production meeting last night. And producer Jake said at one point while we were watching that to like try to find a good clip, he was like, I don't understand. I mean, if you're a right winger, what, like, on that worldview, what can you really do as an individual? I mean, like, besides like voting, it's not like, you know, because I mean, if you're trying to advance a left project, then it's like, okay, you can like organize a union in your workplace, you know, blah blah blah, right? But it's like, look, they don't want you to do any of that, right? So it's like, within this worldview, what can you really do as an individual? And then I was reading you know, I was reading your review last night, and I got to the answer, which I texted him the screenshot. I was like, oh, here you go. Here's your answer, which is the last 100 pages or so of Right Wing Revolution could be summed as don't watch porn or the woke win.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, look, my sense of this, and this is purely speculative, by the way, is again, Kirk does not have enough independent thoughts of substance to jump on this self-help bandwagon without being pushed towards it. My feeling is that he was probably inspired by listening to people like Jordan Peterson, watching the popularity of people like Bronze Age Pervert or Raw Egg Nationalists. Look them up. It is a thing, right? And I was kind of like, you know, this seems to be what's trending right now.
Yeah, I thought I knew all the right-wing weirdos. I'm actually not familiar with Mr. Raw Egg.
Well, by all means, delve into that, right? You're in for a treat. If you want your fascism delivered even weirder than with Bronze Age Pervert, then fucking have I got something for you. But, you know, again, I think Charlie looked at these people trending and was like, well, they kind of offer a combination of lifestyle tips and really a strong emphasis on you got to get swole and hate fat people, or again, the Marxists win. And that's pretty much what the last third of the book is, right? It's women, make sure you have a lot of children. Men, get swole. Don't watch porn or the woke win. And above all else, you should at least try to read books. And if you can't really do that, make lists of books that you're going to read, and call everyone else lazy for not at least coming up with lists of books that they're going to read. Don't actually have to read them, but at least create a list of stuff that you're going to, because the intention of wanting to read the book is in many ways better than actually reading it itself. And it was really fucking frustrating going through those 100 pages. I was like, Charlie, if you really fucking don't want to waste people's time, which you keep saying you want to do, just fucking boil this down to, again, do 50 fucking push-ups, eat some fucking kale, read the Bible, and don't jerk off. And that's all we need to say for those pages. Could have spared me a couple hours of time. And you know what? I could have actually started living your lessons with that time, I'd say, from reading your book. But instead, I just had to see my life drifting away, moment by precious moment, like a character in, Dr. Faustus, watching the clock disappear and thinking I could be doing anything else other than reading it. And it's deeply unfair, and I want my fucking time back.
Well, you do it for us. So on that note,
Sure. I want to say I do love your audience, and I do love the people who read these reviews. I appreciate it. The enthusiasm for these things fuels me. So thank you guys. I appreciate that.
No, we appreciate it. All right. We are going to go to the post game for patrons, where we are going to get a sneak peek at Matt Walsh's new cinematic offering, among other things. So Matt is going to join us for that. So if you are a patron, you should already have the link. We're actually pretty close to being on time to what it says on that link. And if you are not, there's no time like the present to get your life together and become one. Patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I should also say before we go that my new publication, pamphlet from Everyday Analysis, 4 essays on Palestine, is I think possibly out. I haven't gotten my copies yet, but I think they might have already been rolling off the printing press in the UK. So this is we have a link to that in the comments. Mr. McManus, Dr. McManus, has a book about liberal socialism, which you should expect to hear much more about here very soon. We'll definitely do an episode about it at some point. Matt and I are going to be doing a session about it at the Historical Materialism Conference in London in November. And
which reminds me, if you are from the UK, feel free to send us a message. I'm always down to grab a drink at a bar.
Yeah.
I've been known to have a few in my time.
So, is what they call them.
So hit me up. Always down here to meet people.
Absolutely. And I'm also going to try details and actual organizing of this, all extremely pending, but sometime around the end of the year, I'm also going to try to bring Matt down to Los Angeles to do something to promote the book in person there. So do stay tuned on that if you live in Southern California. But in any case, all stuff to look out for. But right now, we are going to go to the post game. Left is best.
Left is best.